My name is Bernard Aschwanden. At Publishing Smarter, one of the things we do is create videos, like this one, to help people learn how to use their software tools better. This video is going to show you how to work with structured authoring, and specifically DITA-based content. This video is based on the first part of a presentation that I do for organizations like the STC, the Society for Technical Communications, or other groups that are looking to get started with DITA. As you're watching the video, I want you to keep a couple things in mind, especially if you're one of the people who takes a lot of notes. Not all of the slides or the topics that I address are going to have equal weight, so feel free to use what you can and discard the rest. Some of it will be far more useful to you down the road, some of it might be information you're already familiar with. The slides are a reference, so I might go pretty quickly on a couple of them. Now, normally in a live presentation, I ask people to participate with questions and ask them as they come up. But you're always welcome to email information to me as well, and I'll try to get you back details. If you are taking notes and you come back to this later on in order to review it, just note the slide number down in the bottom corner. That way you can quickly jump ahead to exactly where you need to be. And lastly, I'd love to claim that any of the errors or the typos that you find are going to be in there intentionally, but they isn't, ain't, and weren't never. I'll fix them as I can. If you see something, send me an email and I'll be happy to update it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bernard Aschwanden, and I'm the president of the company called Publishing Smarter. I've been doing work in documentation and training since about 1992, and I act as a consultant and a trainer in content management systems, XML, DITA, and other publishing technologies. I'm also involved with the STC. I'm on the board of directors and continue to do work in local communities. At Publishing Smarter, some of the things that we do include helping people improve content creation, management, and their distribution workflow. We do this in a couple of different ways, but primarily through content analysis, legacy file conversion, training, and related support. The main goal that we have as a group is to help reduce the production costs, improve the document quality, and increase the employee productivity for our clients. For people who are taking an entire course, these learning objectives are touched on all the way through from start to end. In this video, we're only touching on a few pieces. But normally, I'd like to get people to the point where they can identify the XML tagging and the syntax and how it works in the world of DITA, and what the DITA specification says and what the core elements are that people would use, generally speaking, day to day. I get people comfortable with creating topic, reference, concepts, and tasks, and then taking those standalone pieces and using them as part of a map document. So you actually build a map, which is sort of like a consolidated document that pulls together several independent pieces of information. I also give you the chance to work with different software tools, and that could be FrameMaker from Adobe, it could be XMetal from Just Systems, it could be the Oxygen XML tool, XML Spy, whatever the tools are that are out there, there's a lot of them available that let you build DITA content. All of the content that people build, I collect, I take that content, and I run it through the DITA toolkit. What this allows you to do is see the conversion of the DITA source material into things like PDF and HTML so that you get an idea of what's possible. And lastly, I also touch on some of the key issues that should be considered whenever anyone decides that they want to implement DITA or convert any of their legacy content. And then here's my disclaimer. In the interest of brevity, I will be making some blanket statements about DITA just to keep things simple. So not every single thing that I tell you is 100% DITA. I will stay as close as I can, and I'll likely get in trouble from DITA purists. Frankly, in some cases, they're wrong. In other cases, though, they do make totally valid points. Again, my goal is to teach you about DITA, not to teach you every single thing about it. The difference between that, it's a little bit like learning about driving in a controlled space, where somebody goes out into a parking lot on a weekend when there aren't any cars around in an industrial complex and says, here you go, get in on the driver's side, turn the car on, turn the car off, put it into gear, move ahead 10 feet, bring it to a stop, back it up 10 feet, bring it to a stop, move ahead, turn left, turn right, very basic, simple things. It's not starting somebody off by throwing them onto the freeway in the middle of rush hour, driving a transport truck and saying, go. Those objectives I mentioned earlier, they're broken out into these many sessions, and what we're addressing here is really just the first session, dealing with what is structure. As far as the first session is concerned, there is a lot of background information that I'm going to deliver, and then I'll give you an idea of an assignment or an exercise that you can try on your own, just to take a short piece of information and rework it a little bit around some of the ideas that I discuss. In a little more detail, here's what I'm going through today. I'm going to teach you how structuring can benefit your authoring environment, what you can get from it. I'll show you how to identify the core benefits of any structured writing environment based on DITA by giving you a good overview of the main purpose of DITA. I'll also organize some content into the logical topics DITA uses and then combine them together into a map and publish from one source so that you get a chance to see how that would work. Consistent content is generally going to be better content. DITA gives you that structure, that initial piece that you need so that you can improve content and reduce a lot of the manual workflows that people run into every single day when they have to create documentation. I'll try to give you a chance to see a little bit of a sample of this in action. It's not going to run all of it through the toolkit in the video necessarily, but in this video I definitely outline things on a high level and show you a little bit where we start to dive into the details as well. There is a lot to cover and it will be done in a shorter time frame, so bear with me. I'm going to continue to work our way through this, and as I do, if you need to, feel free to pause, to back up, to take as many notes as you want. And again, you can always email questions to me. My contact information is at the very end. I'll begin by talking to you a little bit about structure and how the structure can actually benefit your authoring environment. Structured authoring boils down to a couple of key things. Structure itself implies that there's a set of defined rules, and I would consider authoring to be the creation of content. So in a structured authoring environment, if the rules are followed, the content becomes more consistent in its structure and organization. All of the material that you write consistently follows a set of rules, and software tools can help enforce this. Now, good structure does not mean good English. You can still have typographical errors, you can still have incomplete sentences, you can have fragments, and good structure does not mean good logic. Just because somebody consistently puts together a set of steps in a very organized fashion doesn't necessarily mean that the steps themselves are in the right order. I can have very clearly written, very good English content in a set of steps, and it turns out that the steps, rather than progressing from first to second to third to fourth, are actually written in such a way that when somebody looks at it, they say, step number 2, that should actually be the last step. So good English and good logic are not enforced by structured authoring. This means that people still need to be able to write well and they need to be able to think. These become incredibly crucial skills for anyone who's in technical communications. There's a lot of reasons to care about structured authoring. We're all aware that documentation costs money. You spend money on things like researching and reviewing the materials, finding the right software tools, getting training on them, building your different types of outputs, whether it's PDF or HTML, help files, a mix of those, different formats. And of course, there's the need to customize the material for different clients or partners that you work with. Multiple audiences, multiple outputs. If you print and then you ship, there's costs associated with that. And structuring can definitely save you money. Bear in mind I say it can, not it will. If it's done right, in most cases it will save money, but you have to think long term. You're not looking at making your money back necessarily in weeks or even months. It could take 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years. It depends on the complexity of the source material. It depends on what you're doing with that material in order to deliver it. It depends on whether you're translating it. It depends on whether you're reusing it. There's so many factors that come together. But long term, in almost every single instance, moving to a structured environment, and in many cases, specifically to DITA, will save money. So, how do you save money? Well, in the long term, there's a lot of benefits that are going to offset that short-term cost. Your documentation ends up being able to be created, modified, versioned, stored, published, translated, customized, distributed, and a lot more with a lot greater ease. A lot of the manual processes start to go away. Content is programmatically modified or assembled. So tasks that in the past were manually done become automated. And you do save money if you're testing tools or you're comparing CMS tools. By and large, the savings are going to be time, money, and then the intangibles like your own sanity, at least early on. Those are the bigger savings. And what I mean by this is that content that is organized into an XML type of an environment can programmatically be changed. It's like HTML. If you think about HTML, most web pages that you view are dynamically built for you. When you go to Amazon, when you go to Google, the Google News site, all of that is programmatically assembled by pulling some of the material, but the original source content had to be properly built by somebody who knows what they're doing and who's doing it right. Do you actually need to know all of the XML code? No. But I want you to have a little bit of an idea of what happens under the hood when you're working with structured content. Generally speaking, XML has markup, and it's going to be looking a little bit like what you might see inside the HTML world. So the example here is start paragraph. This markup is start emphasis, not, and the emphasis, perfect, but it will suffice as simple content for our purposes. End paragraph. The XML generally has a set of rules so that it will ensure the content follows a given standard. And those standards are usually written as something called a DTD or a schema. Now, some people might argue, and rightly I believe, that a style guide, if it's used correctly, can be seen as basic structure. If in your style guide you have instructions to the user as to where a title might appear, or how to organize some of the information, that's a basic structure. The problem is the style guide is often a document that somebody looks at and thinks about, but there isn't the same way of enforcing the style guide as there is to enforce the structured rules. Because there is this DTD or schema behind the scenes, you have the capability to create content and then take that created content and compare it against the rule set and identify whether or not the rules have actually been followed. And even better, the rules can be validated in real time as you create content so that you don't inadvertently leave something behind or mix up the order. This means that there's a lot of benefit to structure. One of them is, as mentioned, the standard rules, the DTD or the schema. It also means that you have consistent content because those rules have to be followed. But there's additional benefits. There's neat things like programmatically applied formatting. Right now, if you take a chunk of information that has a heading 3 and below it a bunch of heading 4s, and you take all of that information and you promote it up to become a heading 1, you have to remember manually to go back and change your heading 4s into heading 2s, which is a headache. Programmatically, though, in a structured environment, you can parse the title, and based on the context, is it 1 level, is it 2 levels, is it 3 levels deep? You can automatically apply heading 1 or heading 2 or heading 3. You can also go through and automatically format a title differently if it's in a figure than if it's in a title. So now you only have one element called title, but the context of use drives the way that it's formatted. Other neat things, you can let other people and companies build support into applications. If you're working with something like DITA, there are a ton. There are now probably hundreds of tools out there that in some way will work with the DITA source material. Let other people do that heavy lifting. You can also automatically exchange files with customers or with clients or with partners. If there is an agreement that everybody is going to be working with the DITA content or XML based on a specific standard, you can do a full file interchange. Here's my XML. Why don't you open it up with your tool? We already do this with HTML. Here's my file. Why don't you open up my web page with your browser, whether it's on a Mac or a Windows machine, whether it's Google Chrome, Microsoft Internet Explorer. Heck, for that matter, open it up with your phone. As long as that support is created and properly built, then you can exchange that information. Others can also develop basic content transformations. And what I mean by that is you write your content, whatever you want to write it with, however you want to write it, as XML, and more specifically as DITA, and then content transformations can run against it and say, take that XML code and display it as a PDF instead, or convert it into a help file, or build web material. So now you can use software to deliver your source material in other formats, and you spend a lot less time developing your own code and a lot more time working on making sure that your message is clear and concise. This is one of those slides that's a little more text-rich. Actually, it's filled with bullet points. You may or may not need all of this, but I want you to be aware of it. This is about the documentation review. If you're going to structure, what are some of the things you need to think about in regards to existing materials, existing rules, existing anything that you have as an organization? So the first thing, consider the materials beyond your standard components of the documentation. Don't just think about, here is the file that I've typed up. Think about why and how that file was created. What's your corporate style guide? What are the rules as far as content is created? How about existing templates? Existing templates will already have a look and feel. They may already have rules in place as far as what types of information is allowed to be created. Also, look back over feedback that you've received from the developers, the engineers, customers and managers, anyone. Another consideration is independent structures, templates, documentation sets, corporate style guide, any of those, anything that might be required that you don't yet have. So think about what you have, think about what you don't necessarily have, but you might need. The content, any of the content that you review should be representative of the entire body of work. Don't go back and look at your material and only look at page 712 of your command line interface. Instead, get something that is more broadly representative in order to think your way through material. You're going to do your best. You'll refine it as you move forward. There are going to be evolutions in documentation, rules that change. Think about those future needs. Also, don't spend all of your time on one file and getting bogged down and trying to make it perfect. If one out of your 5,000 pages is giving you grief, forget it. Rework that one page. If one table doesn't fit into the model, if one specific procedure doesn't do what the structural rules require, but the majority of the rest of your content does, you know what? You'll have to rework that piece, so be it. There will be older concepts, older content that you have to discard as you move to a structured approach to writing. Sometimes the way that you've done stuff for the last year, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years needs to change in order to take advantage of changing technology, changing processes, and also the changing audience. The way that people are consuming information today is not the same as they were consuming it 5 years ago. You should also identify if any of the content's required elsewhere. Start to think about reuse. In the past, have you manually copied and pasted information? In the past, have you used text insets? Have you used conditional text? And if not, are there places where those things could be taken advantage of? Lastly, one of the other things to do during any document review is to go through and figure out whether or not information can be chunked into logical pieces that can then be extracted and reused. Just because something's required in another place is one reason for reuse, but there are others, not just the entire piece, but selective pieces of information. You have notes that you use in many places. The same way that we take graphics and, generally speaking, reference or link to them so that if the graphic is being used 10 times, it exists as one object. We want to start doing that with text. Related to that previous slide, a few other ideas to consider. Any analysis should not generally be done by one person. And the reason for that is that one person ends up bringing in a personal bias, whatever it might be. Instead, try to get the feedback of a department or a team. Actually, try to get the feedback from anybody who's involved in the documentation lifecycle. That's from the project planning, through to product management, through to support desk, and yes, even down to the customers, the engineers, the writers, whoever it is that's working with the material start to end, get some input. There should be involvement by people who do know the documentation, even if you do end up getting somebody else as a professional to come in and do the analysis. Anytime that I'm working with a client, I want people who created or worked with or need to use the documents to give input, because there's probably a good reason things were done. Even if there isn't a good reason, if it's a bad reason that things were done, I still want to know that. You also want to avoid over-analysis. Don't spend months and months with too many cooks and no end in sight, huge committees trying to work their way through documentation, unless you're dealing with hundreds of thousands, millions of pages, something along those lines. Then, yeah, you know what? You probably need to go in and do a lot more work. If you are partnering with a company, whether it's mine or someone else's, get references from real clients. My mom's going to tell you, oh, Bernard does great work with software. I don't know what he does specifically, but it's great. That's not a good reference. Get a reference from a real client and ask some of the tougher questions, like what did not work the way you expected it to, and how was it resolved, and what do you think of it now moving forward? Those become really interesting conversation points. Take the time to go to conferences, go to events, learn everything that you can along the way, and ask for help. If you're going to spend the time and money in getting a content management system, in going to a structured writing environment, converting all of your material, and you're looking at tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, then some of those additional costs dramatically can impact the success of any project. Take the time, spend the money to make sure that you know you're doing things right. When you do decide to move to structure, there are lots of rules to pick from, all kinds of formal specifications. A couple of core ones that you've likely heard about: S1000D. DocBook, DITA. I insert any other choice that you have here and here and here. There's a lot of standards out there. In order to discuss anything to do with structured authoring means that you have to discuss standards. And in order to talk about structured authoring, there has to be a standard. So the focus of what I'm going to be doing is DITA. There's a few more slides that are pretty text rich, but then I'll get into visual representations, a lot of ideas, a chance for you to do some stuff hands-on and to see my solution, and it's only one idea, but my solution to some of the hands-on work. I want to talk about structure in DITA and the core benefits of a structured writing environment based on DITA. I'm not saying DITA is the only solution, but DITA is a solid one. It is established in the technical communications field. There are a lot of software tools that work with this. There's a lot of courses available. There's a lot of support in the industry. That's one of the core reasons that I'm going to focus on DITA. What do we have DITA for? What's the purpose? Two ways of looking at it. One is according to the actual official DITA documentation. And it says, and you can read this, but I'll say it, the Darwin Information Typing Architecture 1.2 specification defines a set of document types for authoring and organizing topic-oriented information, as well as a set of mechanisms for combining, extending, and constraining document types. According to me, just as a very simplified, and this is where I get into that, it's not 100%, but it brings across the idea and will refine it moving forward. DITA is a formal XML-based rule set for creating content that many people in TechCom already work with. DITA enables enhanced use of source content in a vendor-independent way. There's lots of choices, there's lots of tools. When I say there's lots of choices and there's lots of tools, I mean that DITA should matter to you because it is a growing standard with a lot of vendor support. More and more companies that are hiring are also looking for DITA skills. The better paying jobs often are related to something like DITA. And it's not just structured writing. XML and structured writing is great, but DITA also incorporates a lot of best practices. Things like giving you the time to plan your content, helping you to organize information, helping you develop the relationships between materials, and of course, automating where it makes sense. And you can see a lot of vendors support the DITA specification. Trying to capture an idea like DITA in a single slide is a little tricky, so let me show you what it stands for first of all with a little bit of information to expand on each of these. DITA, the D, Darwin. It means that the DITA world is evolving and adapting. Over time, DITA is adding new topic types, new elements, as well as tools and best practices. DITA also supports specialization. So when it can't meet your needs, you can customize it. IT is information typing. Your information is organized or classified into core ideas like tasks, concepts, and references. A is for the architecture, a formal set of rules. These were planned and developed. DITA, the Darwin Information Typing Architecture, will change over time in order to add new support for different information types because of the way that it was planned from the beginning. But really, it's about topics and maps, and I'll talk more about both of those. The other thing is that it exists to connect people and content. That's really what DITA will do. Based on that last slide, I want to expand on a few core ideas of DITA. The idea of the map or the book map. This is where you plan, organize, and publish your content. Generally speaking, think of the map or the book map sort of like an Adobe FrameMaker book document, or in a help file, that table of contents that runs down, usually on the left-hand side. In that environment, you have the parent and the child, you have all kinds of information that's set up and will eventually end up with primary titles, heading 1s, heading 2s, heading 3s, all the way from the top to the bottom. That's roughly what a map or a book map allows you to do. The book map is a little more geared towards publishing content, so it includes support for things like this is a cover page, this is a table of contents, this is a chapter or an appendix or an index. You also have topics. Topics are generally a task, concept, or reference. So these are the core types of information that somebody would create in the DITA world. Discrete standalone pieces that explain what a task, how you do something, what a concept, why you would do it or what is this, and a reference, the technical specification. The topics are where most people spend their time writing. You also have something called a Reltable. This helps build the relationship between information and maps. In a map, it's pretty easy to imagine that you have things that are primary and secondary topics, or that they're set up with a heading 1, a heading 2, a heading 3. One of the things that gets a little tricky though is if you have something that's a heading 3 in one environment, but kind of important in a completely different place when you're dealing with something that's a heading 2, how do you get those two pieces to link back and forth to each other? They don't share the same parent topic necessarily. They don't share anything other than what the relationship table defines. And the relationship table is directly related to its use in a map. So in one map, you could decide that a set of 8 topics link to each other in one way through the relationship table, and then you could take half of those 8 topics and use them somewhere else and have a completely independent set of links that do something totally different because a different relationship table is used. So what the relationship table gives you is a way to take one collected set of topics and decide that they should be linked. And in a completely different environment, you could have a different relationship table with a completely different set of links between the topics. All of the linking is now managed outside of the topic rather than internal to the topic. So you're not spending all of your time going through and managing links. That becomes really important, and we'll talk about it later in more detail. And lastly, there's specializations. And I'm not going to say much about this other than to say that DITA does allow you to customize as needed if other options have already been exhausted. So after you get comfortable with the DITA world, you can then make the decision to specialize if it doesn't cut it, if there is not enough support for what you want. In behind the scenes, though, there's something called attributes. So this is behind the idea of a map, a book map, a topic, a Reltable, or a specialization. Attributes are metadata. They're information about the different elements. If you're familiar with HTML, think about something like an image. An image has attributes like the source, the height, the width, and then those have values. Well, in the same way, there's attributes that are used in the DITA world for all kinds of different things. Generally, a pretty good argument can be made for the reasons that DITA is better than structure, but I want you to think about a generic structure. Imagine if you're trying to build your own. It would become company or industry specific. That means that every single vendor who's out there has to work to yet another standard, and as somebody I know mentioned once, the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. Instead, with DITA, the primary vendors already support it. We saw that in an earlier slide. There's a lot of third-party partners to pick from. A lot of that heavy lifting is already done, so you end up with lower costs, testing becomes easier, prototyping can be done pretty quickly, lots more, and it's going to follow in some of these slides. I mentioned there's a lot of text-rich slides. The next couple are going to be far more visual. I want you to visualize the overall process. This is just one approach of how DITA may work, and I'm going to demonstrate it a little bit in the slides. Now, think about the initial plan for a collection of topics. We would have a product that we have to document and some of the topics. For my purpose, let's assume the following. You're going to document a word processor. People are newer writers. Their experience level is basically, novice users. They have a general familiarity with things like Windows. There's some basic tasks that they're going to have to perform. So some of the main topics that we have to write about that people may want to work with might include some or all of the following. Somebody sits down and brainstorms and says, well, let's give them a product overview and teach them how to launch the software, how to create, how to import, how to save or use save as, how to close and open, and how to delete the material. Now, not every topic is going to have a future life. That brainstorming may have a bunch of things that don't apply or that become specific to a certain audience. In any case, you would take that list of topics and you begin to assign topic types. So consider those primary DITA ideas of task, concept, reference. And it's not to say that each of them has to have only one. Some topics might end up having more than one topic type. A good example would be something like saving files. The task, how do I save? That's pretty straightforward. But the concept, why would you want to save files? And maybe why would you save files to a backup drive? Or why would you save files to a server instead of to your local hard drive? Then there's also references. What types of file formats are supported when we save? That's usually in a table, something that someone would look up. The core of most of the DITA model is going to be the task. Think about this. People are usually reading the help because something failed. And the reason it failed is, or the reason they've identified that something failed, is because they're trying to do something and they're not successful. So the task becomes an incredibly crucial part of anything that you create in the DITA world. I'm not saying that the task is the only thing that you develop. just that often it's one of those core starting points, depending on the type of documentation. If you do a lot of reference material, it might not have tasks in it at all, and the DITA model still works. This is why it's important to develop a map. At a high level, decide on a primary goal. If it's a user guide, then probably a set of tasks. If it's something like a reference guide, the primary goal to give a consolidated place where people can find information. In any case, make the goal absolutely clear. And then, after you've started to organize the information that you have, figure out what supporting content do you also need. Here I'm representing the map in one way, specifically as an organization chart. I've arbitrarily decided that the primary goal that I'm going to have for the topic that I'm working with is how to manage files. Now that's going to include a couple things, a concept. What do I mean by manage files? But then it's also going to have things like a task on how to create, the concept of save as, which has two tasks, how to save and how to use save as, the reference of supported formats, the task on how to close, and the task on how to open. You can also visualize the map as a table of contents, where the main chapter is going to be manage files, and it's going to have several subordinates. Managing files, create a document using save and save as, which in turn has its own two subordinates, and then three more pieces that would fall under managing files. Both are totally legit representations of the map. For the next couple of slides, I want to work with this style of a map. This map I'm using just to plan out some of my content. I have managing files as my primary topic, and that's pretty broad. It encompasses a lot of different concepts, tasks, and references. And as we can see here inside the save as, there's the concept, which in turn has two subordinates. So I might end up with a chapter title for manage files, a bunch of heading ones for the concept of manage, the task on how to create, concept on save as, the reference on formats, and a lot of other task related information. So I end up with chapter title, heading 1, and heading 2. Here you can see under the main topic of manage files, I have a specific topic, the concept, C_manage, the concept of managing. What do I mean by manage files? So that's one of the topics that I would write. I'm not writing any procedure, I'm not writing any technical information. This would be just the concept. Equal to the concept of manage is the task of how to create. This is where I'm going to write step by step things along the lines of select file, new, choose a template type, click create. Those would be the steps that make up the task of how to create. Here I have three distinct topics. It could be written by three different people. It could be written by one person. It could be the type of thing that's written by two people. Somebody who is an instructional designer and writes all my tasks, and somebody else who very strongly can visualize, conceptualize, explain, who writes all of my concepts. But I have a concept on save as. What is save as? Why would you use it? What's the difference between that and save? And then the procedure, the task on save and the task on save as. Then we have three more topics, formats, closing, etc. Whoever is responsible for writing those is going to write them, but each of these pieces is a discrete topic written by one or more people. In whatever way, we need to create independent, standalone topics where the focus is just on the reference, the task, or the concept. So that's it. Now in a traditional model, somebody might come along and say, you know what? That's my chapter, that's my titles, that's my heading 1s and heading 2s. I'm going to sit down and start writing content. And what else do people do? Linking. People take topics, they write it, and then they create links. And here's where it gets fun. Initially, the links are pretty straightforward. There's a link between the concept of save as and the task of save and the task of save as, which makes sense. We've got a primary topic, we've got a couple of subordinates, and generally makes sense that they should link to each other. Great. Somebody goes in, maybe builds the link manually. Maybe the software tool allows them to automatically manage the link between parent and child. Great. This type of a link, good, easy, straightforward. And of course, if you're going to have this set of links in there anyway, well, what's the big deal? I'll just create one more link, because if you're going to create a file, you should know how to save it. And I guess while you're saving files, you should also know how to create them, because eventually you'll need to build a new one. So, all right, the writer comes along and adds an extra link inside each of these topics, which builds dependencies. It also kind of makes sense that if you're going to talk about supported formats, when you open files, you may as well point to how to open files. And when you're opening files, it makes sense to talk about supported formats. So let's build a link going back and forth between those two. While we're on the topic of building links, if you close a file, probably you want to open up the document at some point in the future. So I guess I'll put in another link there because I'm the writer. I've got a bunch of stuff and I may as well build links because, that's the fun thing to do. Since it is fun, why don't I go and I build links all over the place between all types of topics, and now every single topic in some way is probably connected to at least one or two other topics. Some of them have parent and child, some of them have sibling links, some of them have links that I don't even understand why they exist, but we support links, so let's put in links, and that's what writers end up doing. They don't write content, they create links. Now, in a lot of cases, you end up with more links to manage than you actually have content. Forget links. Forget all of that. Think about the content. That's what we're hired to do. In technical communications, the entire point of putting together material is to think about the user. And we can't think about the user if what we're doing is thinking about links, or thinking about all kinds of other manual processes. That could include things like thinking about where did I use that phrase, or thinking about I've changed it here, did I remember to update it there? Or thinking about I've got to create PDF, but did I remember to set it up so that it's my administrator version before I made a PDF, or was it set up to be my user version before I made it a PDF? Thinking about now I have to create a help file, thinking about I've got to create web output, thinking about did we remember to edit the material, thinking about every single thing except content. So let's take a step back and think about content, and specifically think about content in a structured environment and what we can gain by working with the DITA model. Let's think about links. There's something called a relationship table. I talked about it earlier. Thinking about linking, I start to get to the idea that it would be easier if I could just have the system automatically build links for related information. So this relationship table starts that. In the relationship table, there's 3 tasks that are all inside the same cell. The task on save as, save, and create. That means that if this relationship table is used at the time of publish, then those 3 things link to each other. Pretty straightforward. I also have room inside the row for the concept of save as, which means that the 3 tasks will link to each other and each of them will link into the concept related to save as. The concept of save as will link to the tasks, to all 3 tasks. So in the concept, when I read it, it will read at the bottom something like related tasks, save as, save, create. When I'm looking at the task on save as, it will read related tasks, save, create. But then there will also be a piece that reads related concept, save as. Now imagine that we have to grow that set of links a little bit further. If I come along and I add one more reference into that same row, then one change in one table is going to impact 5 different files. The reference for formats is going to have at the bottom of it something like related tasks, save as, save, create, related concepts, save as. It will then also have automatically links between them when it's published using this Reltable. But at the same time, the 3 tasks and the concept would also automatically gain one more link. And all I did here was I opened up and I modified one relationship table. I didn't spend my time going in and opening up save as and building a link. Save, building a link. Create, build a link. And then to the concept for save as and build a link. Then open up the reference for format and build a link into all 3 tasks and into the concepts, only to have somebody come along and say, it's changed. And then I have to go back and I have to waste more time managing links. The relationship table, the rel table, allows that linking to happen between the content because it's built with a good thought process in place. This is part of what you get out of DITA. Remember the A, architecture, planning. Now, all the planning in the world is great. It's important. It's something that's required. You want to plan your maps. You want to plan your relationship tables. But the writing of the content is pretty much equally important. You can have a great plan. If it doesn't get implemented, it's all for nothing. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the idea of a title and a short description for 3 specific topics. Let's start off by talking about the very first one, the task on how to create. It'll have a title of Create Documents and a short description of new electronic files can be produced as required. So I sit down and I write that content. Once written, I take my map, I publish the map, I get my table of contents, I have my help file, and inside it I have my first piece of information, create documents, new electronic files can be produced as required. Here's where it gets really neat. I have, let's say, two different people doing two different roles. I have the writer who's busy writing topics, but I also have somebody who's managing, maybe an information architect, who's managing the maps and the topics and decides to change around the order, to swap the order of two topics. This is now the result of the topics being swapped in order. The concept of save as has some information underneath it. One of the tasks has been moved away, one of the references has been reorganized. Does it matter? No, that's the great thing. For the writer, this makes no difference. The relationship table will still manage the links, and the link between parent and child will still be managed. As long as the writer consistently and clearly writes information, it really doesn't matter if the information is reorganized outside of what the writer is doing. It just has to be thought about and it has to be planned. My writer charges ahead. As the writer, person sits down, creates a concept called save as, and writes a title, saving with a specific name. And then there's a short description, some additional information. Hopefully it doesn't repeat the title word for word, but enhances it. Just make sure that all of the information that's required is there for somebody to very quickly get a good idea of what it is that they're going to be reading, what it is that they're going to be learning. Now, the publish gets interesting. There's the title, there's the short description, saving with a specific name, and underneath it is the same short description that we just saw a moment ago. But there's more info. Two full sets of links are automatically created. One set of links is because of the relationship between the parent and the child. Saving with a specific name has two children, one for saved documents and one for file format, and so automatically as a subordinate, the title and the short description for each of them is inserted and pushed in a little bit. There's also a set of related tasks and a single related reference. That information is automatically generated because of the use of the Reltable, and those related tasks and related reference pieces are also automatically linked with the title. Even better, when you hover over those, the short description can be set up to be a pop-up in order to give somebody more detail before the link is even clicked. I can also drive output through attributes. And what I mean by attributes and output is the following. Think about the map, think about the topics that have already been created, but now I'm going to come along and make a change to the map. I create an additional task, how to delete, but the only people that I'm going to give information to about how to delete is my administrators. So the task for delete on a map level is told that this only applies to the audience of an administrator. You can see this comparison of the table of contents that when I publish, my map can be published into two environments. One of them is for the administrator and it contains that delete a document component, and the other is for my general day-to-day user, which does not have that information. One set of material, two different audiences that I'm delivering to, and contextually, based on the build, I'm going to see different links. Under Manage Files, for the day-to-day user, I would not see a subordinate for delete. It would end with links to close a document, open a document. Under the Manage Files, where I do have delete a document, it appears because I publish a map, not for the day-to-day user, but for the administrator. And because of that one attribute, it changes all kinds of things in the publishing. Hopefully you've got a little bit of an idea of some of the things that you can do in the DITA world. I managed links through my map. I managed my parent and child relationships. I managed publishing. I also went through and I took several independent topics and worked with them and created tasks and concepts and references. In order to get to that point, I want you to just start thinking a little bit about legacy material and how it might fit into this model. I have a set of provided text that you can mark up. I would suggest you use unique colors to identify the topic types, so find your tasks, your concepts, your reference information. I would also suggest look for the task first. This is the core information that people need so that they can do something. I also want you to think about the related supporting content, and that could be tasks or references. There could be many. There could be all kinds of information in there. I would suggest you rework some of the topics based on ideas that I've just talked about. How do you work it into a task, a concept, a reference? Just pull it apart into at least those three ideas. You might want to pause the video in a few moments and take sort of 5 to 10 minutes to play on your own, because after a few moments of showing you the screen on video, you will have the opportunity to see my solution to it. And it's not to say it's the right one, it's just one way to look at it. And again, if you don't agree with some of the things that I've done, if it doesn't make sense to you, fire me questions by email. I'm happy to try to help people out so that they can learn as much as possible. This source content has a little bit of task, a little bit of concept, a little bit of reference in it. It is a little tricky at first to figure out the best way to work with it. What I would suggest is you take this information and at the very least visualize sentence by sentence. Is it a task, a concept, a reference? It gives you a way to work with it. What I do is I pull it into Microsoft Word, and inside Word I just use the highlighter feature, and sentence by sentence I go through it. Now, I would suggest you pause and you go through and you take a good look at what's on the screen in front of you, because in a few moments I'm going to move ahead in the video and you're going to see one possible solution. Again, it's not the right one, it's just a couple of ways that I've worked with the material inside Word to give you an idea of what can be done. Alright, here we go. One of the very first things I do is I just copy the text. I happen to have the source electronically, and I plug it into a Word document. If you wanted to, you could also type the information in, or again, you can just visualize it and work your way through. But moving ahead, you'll see what I do next. At the bottom, I've added in task, concept, reference, and I've just gone through and I've used the highlighter in order to mark it up a little bit so that these pieces stand out. Then the next thing I'm going to do is select individual sentences and apply those highlighter colors to them so that I can find very quickly by scanning if it's a task, a concept, or a reference. If I'm not sure, I may just leave it and not change it at all. The first couple of lines get marked up pretty quickly. As a matter of fact, that whole first paragraph strikes me as concept, sort of background information, something someone should be aware of before they actually start doing anything so that they then can work their way into the task and understand why the task is being performed. I've also highlighted two sentences in yellow. The keep in mind, hire qualified experts to assist you with each step in this process I've flagged as a task, because that sort of strikes me as a prerequisite. Then I've also flagged, and this one's pretty straightforward, the first step in building a wind farm is choosing a location that has enough wind resources. That's pretty straightforward, it's a task. The next couple of sentences I've set them up as reference, and then I started mixing together concept and reference information. And finally, I end with your engineer may use specialized services and software, etc. I'm not sure. It could be a concept, it could be a reference, so I'm not going to flag it. At the bottom of the screen, I've added in a heading for the task, and I just copied the keep in mind and the first step information down into there. Really, I could delete it. Now that I have my task set up with the two pieces in it, I should probably do the same thing for a concept and for a reference. What I end up with here are three unique topics: a task, a concept, a reference from my initial source. The task, pretty straightforward. The concept and the reference have a shared sentence. I'm not sure if it belongs in a concept or a reference. I'll put it into both initially and then further rework the material. In the reference, technically, I could probably take the last paragraph and remove the highlighted text that begins a tool called an anemometer and move it elsewhere, because that might become a glossary entry. But I've taken my information, I've organized it to a general task, concept, reference. I would then take this material and rework it and tweak it around a little bit, make sure that I have a clear title instead of task, concept, and reference. I'd make sure that there's a solid short description to get started, and I'd make sure that these pieces become part of a map. Now, in a structured writing environment, I can come along and begin to focus on the body, the task body, the concept body, and the reference body, and put together the associated information that will specifically help the user perform the task, understand the concept, or find the technical information that's needed inside a reference. I have a structured authoring environment, I have a planned map, and what I end up with is an authoring environment that is going to be supporting DITA, best practices, it's going to be supporting the tools, it's going to be supporting the processes, and along the way, you're going to see in future videos how some of these pieces can come together in order to give you a complete unified content strategy that, put in place, gives you a clearer message, gives you exactly what your audience needs, and it helps you deliver the right information in the right format, at the right time, to the right audience. Hopefully the information in the video has been useful to you. My contact information is provided here, including an email address, which is my preferred way of getting information from you. But you also have my home phone number here, my Twitter accounts if you want to follow me, either the Publish Smarter for Business or the Aschwanden for STC, which relates to a lot of my STC community work, as well as my LinkedIn profile. If you do have further questions, if there's anything that's unclear in this video, if you'd like to have more information or you want somebody to review your materials with you, please feel absolutely free to contact me and I'll get back to you as quick as I can. Thanks a lot. Hope this has been helpful.